The desert stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, a sea of golden dunes shimmering with heat. Ethan Cross wiped the sweat from his brow and adjusted his scarf to shield his face from the unforgiving wind. He had spent years wandering this desolate land, scavenging what he could to survive. The world wasn't what it used to be. Technology had failed, cities had crumbled, and humanity now clung to life like dust in the wind. Ethan's sharp eyes scanned the horizon. Something unusual caught his attention, a figure lying motionless in the sand. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't every day he stumbled upon another living soul, let alone in this harsh wilderness. Gripping the hilt of his knife, he approached cautiously. As he drew closer, he realized it wasn't an ordinary person. The figure was a woman, but her skin shimmered faintly under the sun, almost metallic, like polished silver. Her hair, long and dark, glinted with streaks of gold, and her clothes were strange. Some kind of battle-worn armor that looked like it belonged to a sci-fi movie rather than the real world. Ethan knelt beside her and gently shook her shoulder. "Hey, you alive?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the dry air. Her eyes snapped open, startling him. They were the color of emeralds, glowing faintly as if lit from within. She stared at him with confusion and a hint of suspicion. When she spoke, her words were an unintelligible stream of alien sounds. Ethan frowned. It wasn't any language he had ever heard. "Okay," he said slowly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe. Do you understand me?" The woman didn't reply, but her gaze softened. Ethan noticed a deep cut on her arm, the silver sheen of her skin marred by what looked like glowing blue blood. Whatever, or whoever, she was hurt and needed help. "All right, let's get you out of this sun before you cook," he muttered. Slinging her arm over his shoulder, he helped her to her feet. She was surprisingly light, almost unnaturally so. As they trudged back toward his makeshift camp, Ethan couldn't help but glance at her every few steps. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, and questions swirled in his mind. Who was she? Where did she come from? And most importantly, was she dangerous? When they reached his camp, a small sheltered cave stocked with scavenged supplies, Ethan laid her down on a worn-out blanket. The woman watched him silently, her eyes scanning his every move as he fetched a water flask and a clean rag to tend to her wound. "Don't worry," Ethan said, more to himself than to her. "We'll figure out what to do next." Just as he began cleaning her wound, the woman's hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with startling speed. Ethan froze. Her emerald eyes narrowed, and her voice, calm yet firm, spoke a single word he could understand. "Danger." Ethan's stomach tightened. He had no idea what kind of trouble she was talking about, but he had a feeling it was already on its way. The cave offered some relief from the blazing desert heat, but Ethan felt anything but relaxed. The woman, Kalira, as she had finally introduced herself, was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her glowing green eyes scanned every corner of the room, alert and calculating, as if expecting danger at any moment. She sat upright now, her wounds mostly cleaned and bandaged, though her strength was still clearly returning. Ethan kept himself busy sorting through his supplies, trying not to stare. His mind was racing with questions. Who was she? How did she end up in the middle of nowhere? And why had she said danger with such urgency earlier? Kalira's voice broke the silence. It was sharp but had softened since their first encounter. "Thank you," she said in slightly accented English, her words deliberate as though she were still learning them. "You help me." Ethan glanced at her, surprised. "You can speak English now." "Learning. Fast." She tapped a small device near her ear, something that looked like a piece of her armor, but had blinking lights. "Translator." He nodded slowly. "That's useful." Kalira studied him for a moment, then spoke again. "You alone?" "Yeah," Ethan replied. "Been alone for years. People don't trust each other much anymore. Not since, well, everything fell apart." Kalira tilted her head, curious. Your world. Broken. Ethan shrugged. Pretty much. The cities are ruins, the technology's dead, and people are scattered in small groups just trying to survive. What about you? Where are you from? She hesitated, her glowing eyes flickering with something like caution. Far. Away. Another place. Not like this. That's obvious, Ethan muttered, gesturing to her strange armor and shimmering skin. What are you doing here? Kalira's expression hardened. Running. From what? Before she could answer, a faint noise echoed through the cave. Like a distant hum, Kalira's head snapped toward the sound, her posture tense. Ethan heard it too now, a low, mechanical droning growing louder with each passing second. What is that? He asked, his voice tight. Kalira stood quickly, her movements fluid despite her injuries. Hunters. Hunters. What kind of hunters? Her emerald eyes met his, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her gaze. They come for me. Ethan grabbed his knife and flashlight, his heart pounding. How do they know you're here? She pointed to a small device on her armor. Tracker. Active when I fell. Great, Ethan muttered, running a hand through his hair. You're telling me you led alien hunters right to my camp? I did not choose, Kalira said sharply, her tone cold but not defensive. They will kill anyone. Before Ethan could respond, the cave walls vibrated as something heavy landed outside. The hum grew deafening, and a sharp metallic sound echoed through the entrance. Kalira's voice dropped into a calm, commanding tone. Stay back. I will fight. Ethan stared at her, stunned, as she pulled herself to her full height. Even injured, there was something undeniably powerful about her stance. Whoever, or whatever, she wasn't just some alien lost in the desert. She was something far more dangerous. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the narrow cave. Ethan's grip tightened on his knife as the droning hum outside grew louder, vibrating the ground beneath his feet. He glanced at Kalira, who stood calm and motionless, her glowing eyes fixed on the entrance. Despite her injuries, she looked more prepared for battle than he could ever hope to be. What are they? Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. Mercenaries, Kalira replied, her tone cold and steady. Hired by the Zorthan Empire. They hunt me. Zorthan Empire, Ethan repeated, his head spinning. Why? Kalira didn't answer. Instead, she reached to her side and detached a small, cube-shaped device from her armor. As she pressed a button, the cube unfolded into a sleek weapon, part blade, part energy emitter. The edges hummed with a faint blue glow. Ethan swallowed hard. Okay, that's impressive. Stay behind me, she ordered, her voice sharp and commanding. Do not interfere. Before Ethan could argue, the cave's entrance lit up with an eerie red glow. 3 figures stepped into view, their silhouettes tall and menacing. They wore armor that seemed to pulse with energy, and their weapons gleamed in the dim light. Alien rifles with glowing barrels aimed straight at them. One of the mercenaries, the tallest of the group, barked something in a language Ethan didn't understand. Kalira responded in the same tongue, her words quick and biting. Whatever she said, it clearly angered them. The lead mercenary raised his weapon, and without hesitation, Kalira moved. She was a blur of silver and blue light, closing the distance between her and the mercenaries in an instant. Her weapon hummed as she sliced through the first alien's rifle, the pieces clattering to the ground. A swift kick sent him crashing into the cave wall, unconscious before he hit the floor. The other 2 mercenaries fired their weapons, red energy bolts crackling through the air. Ethan ducked behind a rock, his heart pounding as the blast scorched the cave walls. But Kalira didn't flinch. She dodged with inhuman precision, weaving between the bolts like water around stones. Her blade struck again, disarming the second mercenary with a single, calculated strike. The third alien, realizing his mistake, tried to retreat. Kalira caught him by the arm and twisted, forcing him to drop his weapon. She slammed him to the ground, her glowing blade poised at his neck. The cave fell silent, save for the heavy breathing of the last conscious mercenary. Kalira leaned in, speaking in a low, threatening tone. The alien stammered something in response, his voice trembling. "What did he say?" Ethan asked, stepping out from behind the rock. Kalira didn't look at him. "More are coming." Ethan's stomach dropped. "More? How many?" Kalira straightened, her weapon still glowing faintly in her hand. "Enough to burn this world." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. She wasn't just running from trouble. She was dragging it with. Ethan paced back and forth in the small cave, his mind spinning. "Burn this world," he repeated, looking at Kalira. "What does that mean? Who are these people after you?" Kalira stood near the cave entrance, her weapon still in hand. Her glowing green eyes scanned the horizon outside as though expecting another wave of enemies. Her calm demeanor made Ethan uneasy. She acted like this wasn't her first time facing a life-or-death situation. "They are Zorthan mercenaries," Kalira said finally, her voice steady but laced with weariness. "Hired to find me. I am dangerous to them." "Yeah, no kidding," Ethan muttered, glancing at the unconscious mercenary she had effortlessly taken down. "Why? What did you do to make them so mad?" Kalira hesitated, her grip tightening on her weapon. For a moment, Ethan thought she wasn't going to answer, but then she spoke, her words measured. "I led a rebellion, a war, against the Zorthan Empire." Ethan stopped pacing and stared at her. "A rebellion? Like an actual war?" "You?" "Yes," she said, her tone blunt. "I was a commander of the Valteria Uprising. We fought to free our people from the Empire's control." "And?" Ethan pressed, unable to hide his curiosity. "What happened?" Kalira turned to face him, her expression hard but tinged with regret. "We lost. The Empire crushed us. Many of my people were killed. The rest were captured or scattered. I am one of the few who escaped." Ethan whistled softly, running a hand through his hair. "So now they're hunting you down?" "Yes," she said simply. "They see me as a threat even now. If they capture me, they will use me as a symbol to crush any remaining hope of rebellion." Ethan leaned against the cave wall, his mind racing. He'd thought his life was tough, surviving in a broken world, scavenging for food and water. But Kalira's story made his struggles feel small. She wasn't just some lost alien warrior. She was a survivor of a galactic war, carrying the weight of an entire rebellion on her shoulders. "You said they'll burn this world," Ethan said after a long pause. "What does that mean? Are they planning to attack Earth?" Kalira nodded. "The Zorthan Empire does not care for humans. If they believe this planet hides me, they will destroy it. They will send more hunters, then warships." Ethan's chest tightened. "Warships? You're talking about an alien invasion?" "Yes." Silence fell between them, broken only by the faint hum of the desert wind outside. Ethan felt a surge of anger rising in his chest. "So what's the plan? You just keep running until they find you, and we all die." Kalira's gaze met his, unflinching. "No, I will fight. I always fight." Ethan sighed, rubbing his temples. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a scavenger, a nobody. But as he looked at Kalira, this fierce, unyielding warrior who had fought against impossible odds, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: determination. "Then I'll fight too," he said quietly. Kalira raised an eyebrow, surprised. "You would risk your life for this?" Ethan shrugged. "If they're coming for Earth, I don't have much of a choice. Besides, you don't look like the type to lose." For the first time, a faint smile flickered across Kalira's face. "Then we prepare." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the desert, Ethan realized something. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about standing up to something bigger, something worth fighting for. and for the first time in years, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was still hope. Night fell over the desert, the stars above glittering like scattered diamonds. Ethan stood outside the cave, his makeshift spear in hand. He had crafted it earlier, sharpening an old steel rod he'd scavenged from a ruined vehicle. The weapon felt inadequate, especially compared to Kalira's sleek energy blade, but it was all he had. Inside the cave, Kalira worked silently, her focus razor-sharp as she tinkered with a small device she'd salvaged from one of the mercenaries. The glow of her emerald eyes reflected off the metal, her hands moving with practiced precision. She looked like she belonged to another world, because she did. Ethan leaned against the cave's entrance, watching her. "You always this calm before a fight?" he asked. Kalira didn't look up. "Calm is necessary. Panic kills." "Fair point," Ethan muttered. He hesitated, then added, "You don't have to do this alone, you know." Kalira finally glanced at him, her gaze piercing. "You are brave, Ethan Cross, but bravery does not make you invincible." "Never said it did," he replied. "But if they're coming for you, they're coming for me too. I figure we've got a better chance if we work together." Kalira studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Together, then." The distant hum of engines cut through the silence, faint but unmistakable. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "They're here." Kalira stood, her weapon in hand, the blue glow of its blade casting eerie shadows on the cave walls. "Stay close to me," she said. "Watch, learn, survive." The two of them moved to higher ground just outside the cave, crouching behind a ridge of rocks. A small hovercraft appeared over the dunes, its sleek black frame illuminated by red navigation lights. It carried 3 more mercenaries, their figures silhouetted against the glow of the craft's engines. Ethan tightened his grip on his spear. His palms were sweaty, and his heart pounded like a drum. "Got any brilliant plans?" he whispered. Kalira's lips curved into a faint smile. "Follow my lead." The hovercraft landed, and the mercenaries disembarked, their alien weapons at the ready. Kalira moved like a shadow, her steps silent as she descended the ridge. Ethan followed, trying to mimic her grace, but feeling like a lumbering ox in comparison. Kalira struck first, her energy blade slicing through the nearest mercenary's weapon in one fluid motion. The alien barely had time to react before she disarmed him completely, her movements swift and precise. Ethan's adrenaline surged as the second mercenary turned toward him, raising his rifle. Without thinking, Ethan lunged with his spear, jamming it into the weapon's barrel. Sparks flew as the rifle short-circuited, and the mercenary let out a guttural roar of frustration. Kalira took down the third mercenary with a spinning kick, her blade humming as it deactivated. The fight was over in less than a minute. Ethan looked at her, panting. "That was insane." Kalira nodded approvingly. "You learn fast." For the first time in years, Ethan felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was fighting for something real. And Kalira, this otherworldly warrior, was starting to feel less like a stranger and more like a partner. The aftermath of the skirmish left the desert eerily silent, save for the faint crackle of damaged alien tech. Ethan crouched beside the wreckage of the hovercraft, his hands rummaging through compartments and pulling out strange, glowing devices. Beside him, Kalira examined a sleek data tablet she had retrieved from one of the fallen mercenaries. Ethan held up a fist-sized sphere that pulsed faintly with light. "What do you think this thing does?" Kalira glanced at it briefly. "Energy cell." "Leave it. We need this." She tapped the screen of the tablet, her glowing green eyes scanning rapidly through streams of alien text. Ethan frowned, tossing the sphere aside. "What's on there?" "Anything that'll help us." Kalira's expression hardened as she swiped through the data. "Coordinates. Fleet movement. They know I am here. A larger force is coming." Ethan felt a chill crawl down his spine. "How large are we talking?" Kalira paused before answering. "A warship, possibly 2. Enough to destroy this planet if necessary. Ethan sat back, his breath catching. Destroy the planet? For one person? That's insane. They fear what I represent, Kalira said, her voice calm but laced with an edge of bitterness. A symbol. Rebellion. Freedom. If they kill me, they kill the hope of others. Ethan ran a hand through his hair, frustration boiling inside him. So what do? We can't fight an entire fleet. Kalira's gaze met his, unflinching. We do not fight them directly. Not yet. She gestured for him to follow, and they climbed back to the cave. Inside, Kalira set the tablet on a flat rock and began assembling parts from the scavenged equipment. Her movements were deliberate, confident, as though she had done this 1,000 times before. Ethan leaned against the wall, watching her. You've got a plan, don't you? Kalira nodded. The mercenary's craft has a functional distress beacon. I can modify it to send false signals, drawing their attention away from this location. Ethan raised an eyebrow. And what happens when they realize it's a trick? By then, we will be gone, she replied. We need to reach higher ground to send the signal. A place they cannot block. Ethan frowned. There's an old radio tower about 10 miles from here. It's been dead for years, but the height should work. Kalira looked at him, her expression softening slightly. Good. We go at dawn. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. Ethan tried to rest, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind replayed everything Kalira had told him. The war she had fought, the enemies hunting her, the fleet coming to destroy Earth. As the first light of dawn crept across the desert, Ethan stood and grabbed his gear. Kalira was already waiting at the cave entrance, her energy blade clipped to her side, and the modified beacon tucked under her arm. You ready? Ethan asked, forcing confidence into his voice. Kalira's eyes gleamed. Always. As they set off toward the distant tower, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time, and that the fight ahead would test them both in ways they weren't prepared for. The desert stretched out before them, a vast, unforgiving landscape under the early morning sky. Ethan and Kalira moved quickly, their pace steady but cautious as they made their way toward the old radio tower. The harsh winds of the desert whipped around them, but they pushed forward without slowing. Ethan glanced over at Kalira. Her sharp green eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, and her posture was always alert, as if danger could appear at any moment. She had been a warrior her entire life, and it showed. He felt out of place beside her, just a regular guy who had learned to survive by scavenging and hiding. But now, with the threat of the Zorthan Empire looming over them, Ethan knew he couldn't stay in the shadows anymore. He had to stand with her. I've been thinking, Ethan said, trying to keep his voice steady, about what you said last night, about rebellion. I don't know much about wars and fleets and all that, but Earth, we've been through a lot too. Kalira didn't respond at first, but then she gave a slight nod. Earth has a history of resistance, she said softly. You fought back against your own invaders once. I've seen traces of it in your world's history. Ethan smiled, though it was a bitter one. Yeah, if you count small groups of people fighting against much bigger forces. But we never had a leader, never had someone like you. Kalira's gaze softened for just a moment, and she spoke quietly. I am no leader. I have only known war. What is a leader but someone willing to fight for those who cannot? Ethan thought about that as they walked, the wind kicking up sand and swirling clouds around them. He could still feel the weight of Kalira's words on him, and it made him realize something important. It wasn't enough just to survive anymore. If Earth was going to stand any chance against the Zorthan Empire, they needed to fight back, and they needed more than just the two of them. As the old radio tower came into view, Ethan's mind was already planning. There were still small pockets of survivors scattered throughout the desert, people who had been living on the fringes, hiding from the collapse of civilization. Some of them were former soldiers, some were scavengers like him, and others had been part of the old resistance groups. It was time to unite them. It was time for them to take a stand. "We need help," Ethan said suddenly, looking at Kalira with determination. "There are people here, out in the desert. They might not have much, but they've survived for years. If we can get them to stand with us, we might have a chance." Kalira glanced at him, studying him for a long moment. "You would rally them to fight?" Ethan nodded, his voice firm. "We can't take on the Empire alone. But together, maybe we can make a difference. Maybe we can show them that Earth won't just lie down and die." Kalira was silent for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "You're right. We need them." They reached the tower, a rusted and weathered skeleton of the technology that once connected the world. Ethan and Kalira climbed up to the platform, where they set up the modified distress beacon, hoping to pull the Zorthan forces away from their true location. The wind howled as they worked, but both were focused on their task. Once the beacon was activated, they would have no time to waste. "We'll need to move fast," Kalira said, her voice low as she glanced toward the distant horizon. "The signal will buy us some time, but not much." Ethan set the last piece in place and looked at Kalira. "I'll contact the groups. It's time to put Earth's resistance back together." As they finished, Ethan realized the weight of what they were about to do. This was no longer just about survival. It was about something much bigger. It was about saving their home, and maybe, just maybe, proving that humanity was capable of more than just running from its problems. Now it was time to fight back. The wind howled across the barren desert, carrying with it the dust of 1,000 forgotten years. Ethan, perched atop the old radio tower, with Kalira beside him, watched the distant sky. The distress beacon they had set up was now active, sending out false signals meant to mislead the approaching Zorthan forces. They had done everything they could to buy time. But now, the waiting began. "I don't like this," Ethan muttered, gripping the edge of the rusted tower for balance. His eyes scanned the horizon nervously. Kalira stood beside him, her emerald eyes focused on the horizon as well, but there was no panic in her demeanor, only a calm determination. "We will be ready," she said, her voice steady. "They will come for the beacon, not for us. But we must use this time wisely." Ethan nodded, but the weight of the situation pressed down on him. The Zorthan fleet was coming. He could feel it in the air, thick with the promise of destruction. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about saving Earth. Rallying the small groups of survivors scattered across the desert to unite under one cause was only the beginning. Now, they had to fight. Together. "I've contacted the groups," Ethan said, his voice tight with urgency. "They're coming. It'll take them time, but they're heading here." "Good," Kalira replied. "We will make our stand here, at the tower. They will never expect us to be here." As the hours passed, the sky darkened, and the distant hum of engines grew louder. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as the sound grew closer. The mercenaries they had defeated earlier were just the beginning. The real threat was the fleet, the warships that would rain down destruction on the planet if they weren't stopped. Finally, the first of the Zorthan ships appeared over the horizon, a massive, shadowy figure against the setting sun. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. The warship's size was overwhelming, dwarfing everything in the desert below. It was a silent reminder of the power the Empire wielded, a reminder that Earth was just a small, insignificant dot in the grand scheme of things. But Kalira wasn't afraid. "They have arrived," Kalira said quietly. "But we have more than they think. The resistance will not fall easily." Ethan turned to look at her. "Are you sure about this? I mean, we're talking about a whole fleet. This isn't some small skirmish." Kalira's eyes hardened, her expression focused. "It is not the size of the enemy that matters, Ethan. It is the will to fight. Humanity has survived worse than this. You have survived worse. And now, you will fight." Ethan felt a surge of pride. He hadn't realized it until that moment, but Kalira had never seen him as just some scavenger. She had seen something more in him, something worth fighting for. And now, with the fate of the planet hanging in the balance, he couldn't back down. Not now. "We'll need to use the terrain," Kalira continued. "The desert gives us cover. We will attack their landing forces first. Strike fast and hard." Ethan nodded, adrenaline surging through his veins. Let's give them a fight they won't forget. The sky above them darkened further as the fleet descended, the massive warships blocking out the stars. Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The battle for Earth had just begun, and it would be a fight for everything they held dear. As the first waves of Zorthan mercenaries landed on the ground, the resistance began to form up around the tower. Ethan stood with Kalira at the forefront, heart pounding but resolute. The time for waiting was over. It was time to show the Zorthan Empire that humanity had teeth, and they weren't afraid to bite back. The sun had long disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the desert bathed in an eerie twilight glow. The first wave of Zorthan mercenaries had already landed, their sleek black ships dotting the sands like ominous shadows. Ethan and Kalira stood at the front of the resistance, watching as the enemy's forces assembled in the distance. Ethan gripped his spear tightly, his palms sweaty, his heart pounded in his chest, and for a moment he couldn't shake the overwhelming fear gnawing at him. This was it, the final stand. The fate of Earth was about to be decided in the most unlikely of places, the vast, empty desert. "Ready?" Kalira asked quietly, her green eyes sharp and focused. She had her energy blade in hand, its faint blue glow illuminating the area around her. She looked every bit the warrior she was, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he was standing beside someone truly legendary. "As ready as I'll ever be," Ethan said, trying to steady his breath. He looked over his shoulder at the small but determined group of resistance fighters gathered behind them. There were men and women, old and young, all of them wearing mismatched armor and holding weapons of all kinds. Some had old firearms, others had homemade spears and knives. They were far from an organized army, but they had something the Zorthan Empire didn't: a burning desire to protect their home. "Remember the plan," Kalira said, her voice low and commanding. "We hit them fast, disrupt their lines, and draw them into the desert. That's where we have the advantage." Ethan nodded, his grip tightening on his spear. The plan was simple, but dangerous. They would hit the mercenaries hard, scattering them in the open desert, forcing them to chase the resistance into terrain they weren't familiar with. In the confusion, they would slow down the larger Zorthan forces, buying time for reinforcements to arrive. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was all they had. The sound of boots crunching on sand signaled the arrival of the first wave of mercenaries. They marched forward, confident and unafraid, their weapons raised. Ethan swallowed hard. The Zorthan warriors were well equipped, their advanced technology far superior to anything the resistance had. But Kalira had been right. They had the will to fight, and that was something the enemy could never understand. "Now," Kalira whispered, her voice a deadly calm. The resistance moved as one, charging forward with a roar. Ethan felt his heart race as he sprinted into the fray, his spear held high. The mercenaries turned, surprised by the sudden attack, but they quickly recovered, raising their weapons to fire. Ethan ducked behind a sand dune, narrowly avoiding a blast of alien energy. He peeked over the top, looking for Kalira. She was already in the thick of the battle, her blade cutting through the air with deadly precision. Her speed and agility were unreal, as though she was dancing through the chaos, taking down enemy after enemy. Ethan marveled at her skill, but there was no time to watch. He had his own fight to focus on. A mercenary appeared from behind a boulder, aiming his weapon at Ethan. The alien's eyes locked on him, and Ethan's mind went blank. Instinct took over. He lunged forward, thrusting his spear toward the mercenary's chest. The weapon struck true, and the alien fell, dropping his rifle with a screech. "Good job, Earthling," a voice shouted from behind him. Ethan spun around to see a resistance fighter grinning, his face smeared with dirt and sweat. The fighter gave him a thumbs up before rushing back into the fray. Ethan didn't have time to smile. The battle was far from over. The mercenaries were regrouping, and their larger warship was descending into the desert. It was only a matter of time before the Zorthan Empire's full might was unleashed. But Ethan wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything they had fought for. He gripped his spear again and ran toward the chaos. The final stand had begun, and this time, humanity wasn't going to run. They were going to fight, until the very last breath. The battle raged on beneath the starry sky, the desert echoing with the sounds of gunfire, explosions, and the roar of distant warships. Ethan had never imagined anything like this. What had started as a fight for survival had transformed into something much bigger, something worth every ounce of his being. This was no longer just about a single fight. This was about protecting Earth, about proving that humanity had the strength to stand up against the galaxy's most powerful empire. Ethan gripped his spear, moving quickly through the shifting dunes. His heart pounded, but there was no fear, just resolve. The resistance had held their ground, but the Zorthan forces were not easily defeated. Kalira had warned him this wouldn't be easy, and she was right. But they had slowed the mercenaries, and reinforcements from the scattered resistance groups were arriving. Through the chaos of battle, Ethan's eyes searched for Kalira. He spotted her in the distance, surrounded by a group of Zorthan soldiers. She was a blur of motion, her energy blade flashing as she took down one enemy after another with deadly precision. But even Kalira, the legendary warrior from the stars, couldn't fight an entire fleet alone. Ethan pushed forward, his breath coming in quick gasps. He had to get to her. He had to help. But before he could take another step, the ground beneath him shook violently. A massive Zorthan warship, twice the size of anything Ethan had ever seen, hovered above the battlefield, casting a shadow over the desert. Its engines roared, and a deep mechanical voice echoed from the ship's loudspeakers. "Earthlings," the voice boomed, "this is your last warning. Surrender or face total annihilation." Ethan's heart sank. The fleet had arrived in full force. Kalira, hearing the ship's announcement, paused for a moment, her eyes locking with Ethan's from across the battlefield. She was covered in dirt and blood, but her expression was as determined as ever. She had already led a rebellion that spanned across galaxies, but here, on Earth, the stakes were higher than they had ever been. She took a step forward, her voice carrying across the battlefield. "We do not surrender. We fight." Ethan felt a rush of adrenaline surge through him. This was their moment. This was when they would prove that Earth would never kneel. He turned back toward the resistance, raising his spear high. "Fight," he shouted. "For Earth, for freedom." The cry echoed across the battlefield, and the resistance surged forward, rallying around him and Kalira. Even as the Zorthan forces closed in, they fought with everything they had, a surge of courage and defiance sweeping over them. Kalira's blade cut through the air with a precision that was both terrifying and beautiful. She moved like lightning, cutting down one enemy after another, her energy blade glowing brighter with every strike. Ethan was right beside her, fighting alongside the resistance with everything he had, his spear carving through the enemy ranks. But even as they fought, the warship above them loomed larger, its guns powered up, ready to destroy them all. There was no way they could win this battle by force alone. Kalira knew this too. Without warning, she turned to Ethan, her face set in grim determination. "We need to stop the ship. Now." Ethan stared at her, his mind racing. "How?" She pointed to the sky, to a weak point in the ship's massive hull. "There is a vulnerability. I can get us close, but I'll need your help." Without hesitation, Ethan nodded. He knew what had to be done. The two of them ran toward the warship, dodging fire as they went. The battle around them seemed to slow, as if time had bent to their will. They were no longer just survivors. They were the last hope for humanity. Kalira led the way, her blade flashing as she cleared a path. Ethan followed, his heart hammering in his chest, ready to face whatever came next. As they reached the ship's base, Kalira pointed to a large energy core, glowing with dangerous light. "That's the heart. We destroy it, and the ship will fall." Ethan nodded, knowing the risk. "Let's do it." Together, they launched themselves at the core, fighting with every ounce of strength they had. The Zorthan soldiers closing in, but nothing could stop them now. With one final, devastating strike, they brought the heart crashing down, and the warship exploded into a brilliant blaze. As the warship fell from the sky, flames lighting up the desert, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The Zorthan forces were in disarray, their morale shattered. The resistance surged forward, their enemies retreating. They had won. They had defeated the impossible. Kalira stood beside Ethan, her eyes glowing faintly. For the first time, she looked at him with something like respect. "You fought well, Earthling," she said, quail.